I hope all of you are doing well and staying safe in these difficult times. Let me begin by telling you that I often say to people that I find my outreach lectures a far more demanding and engaging task than my lectures to third-year students or my supervisions for MPhil and PhD students, and not the other way around. The reason for this is that in the latter case, with my PhD students, for example, we more or less speak with a common vocabulary. So if I use big words like deconstruction or ontological status, I know that we are more or less on the same page. But on an occasion like this one, I do not quite know how much of common ground I can appeal to. Some of you are perhaps my B16 and C10 students. Some of you may have studied some aspects of Hinduism and Buddhism elsewhere or not. So before we proceed, let me indicate that in the next 30 to 40 minutes or so, I will not speak directly about the specific contents of the movie, The Matrix. In a usual lecture room setting, I would pause the movie at a particular point and comment on how a Buddhist motive may be reflected there or not. Something I won't do here. My aim here, however, is to give you some conceptual tools with which you can answer this question or try to answer this question. Can we treat Hollywood movies and also Bollywood movies as reliable sources with which to teach religion? So as I keep on speaking, I invite you to also keep on reflecting on certain episodes or incidents in the movie that may be related to what I'm saying. And later in the discussion, we can pick out specific episodes. Now, yesterday, when I was thinking about what I would say today, I told myself that I should try my best not to make this yet another boring, pedantic lecture. So before I go into my outline of some of the Buddhist themes that may be reflected in the Matrix, let me start on a somewhat personal note by telling you why I study religion. What is it about the study of theology and the study of religion that excites me so much? And let me put out a very broad question, which I think many of us here have asked in some way or the other. How do I characterize or situate my own academic research and my own lectures? Over the years, I have come to believe and see that the least misleading way to present what it is that I do when I study this complex thing called religion is to say that I am a philosopher in the company of anthropologists. Some year ago, I used to teach in a department of philosophy in Delhi. And even today, my research remains primarily of a philosophical nature. So I study texts written by Hindus, sometimes in Sanskrit, and sometimes in modern Indian languages such as Bengali and Hindi. And I try to analyze the argumentative structures which are manifest or latent in those texts. But at the same time, I'm primarily interested not so much in the text in itself, but what happens to the text when it is received, reworked, and reconceptualized by people who may not describe themselves as Hindus. So in other words, my primary interest lies in studying how real-world human beings of flesh and blood who may not be Hindus have quote-unquote translated these Indic texts. And here we hit the core theme of translation. So for instance, a lot of my research involves studying translations of Hindu and Buddhist texts offered by Christians, both in India and in the West, by Muslims in South Asia, and by Bollywood and Hollywood movies. Since I won't be talking about Islam today, let me give you a concrete Indo-Islamic example of how certain kinds of translations work on the ground in South Asia. You may be aware that some Hindus worship Krishna as the supreme god. And in these Hindu traditions, the supreme god is in fact not just Krishna, but Krishna along with the divine feminine Radha. So you have Krishna, the supreme god, and Radha, the supreme goddess, in a binitarian conception of divinity. So not Trinitarian, but binitarian. God is Radha-Krishna. Now, if you look up on Google some of the iconographic representations of Radha-Krishna, you will see the supremely beautiful Krishna standing under a tree and playing on his enchanting flute with the supremely beautiful Radha at his side. Now, you may think that nothing could be further from Islam than what I had said just now. Islam, which is austere, pure monotheism, and its rejection of any human-shaped imagery in speaking of God. So it may surprise you, and it did surprise me, that in the region, which is today Bangladesh, there have been many Muslim poets who write in Bengali beautiful poetry about Radha and Krishna. And when I describe them as Muslim, this is not my opinion, that is their self-understanding. They regard themselves as Muslim. Now you may ask, how is this possible? That poets who regard themselves as Muslim are working with Hindu religious motive? And the answer is, in one word, translation. So you take the Hindu motive of Radha-Krishna and you translate it very carefully and sensitively in this way. You say that Radha, the divine feminine for Hindus, symbolizes the human soul who is pining for the spiritual guru. And you translate the Sanskrit word guru with the Persian and Arabic pir and murshid. And then you say Krishna symbolizes the spiritual guru who is pointing the way to the supreme God without any human form. So what you have done, if you are a Muslim poet writing about Radha and Krishna, is that you have translated a Hindu motive by reworking and reconfiguring it and resituating it as an allegorical description of the human soul who is being drawn and pulled by the charismatic power of the spiritual guru or the prophet. Now the key question is this: what happens to the content of a Hindu or a Buddhist text when it is received and reworked in this way and translated in this way into Hollywood? Is everything lost in translation? Or is it the case, as I always tell people, that whenever something is lost in translation, something else is discovered and recreated in translation? So translation is not always simply a conceptual loss. Translation is also sometimes a wonderful and somewhat serendipitous form of self-discovery. Before we proceed, I need to add my standard, boring, pedantic disclaimer that terms such as Hindu and Buddhist, they encompass a wide diversity of ways of thinking and ways of being in the world. So in what follows now, the remaining 25 minutes or so, I'm going to speak very specifically about one strand called Mahayana Buddhism. This is a philosophical soteriological system which emerges sometime around 100 to 300 CE, Common Era, in South Asia. And I'm going to give you a conceptual map which says that Mahayana Buddhism can be understood from two standpoints. Number one, the view from ground zero, and number two, the view from spiritual perfection. First, I'm going to spend some time outlining the view from ground zero. According to Buddhist teaching, everything that there is stamped with three characteristics. Number one, impermanence. Number two, not self. And number three, dukkha. Here the key point is that these three characteristics have to be understood jointly in their conceptual interrelations, so that you will grasp the true meaning of one only when you grasp the true meaning of the other two, and vice versa. So let's start with impermanence. In one sense, you do not need Buddhism to tell you that things around you are impermanent. The summer passes away and the winter arrives, and sadly, our loved ones die. But the impermanence we are talking about here is of a much more radical kind. Even now, as you are looking at me, you may think, even if only unself-consciously, that there is a stable you who is looking at me. And that, according to Buddhism, is already a deep-seated fundamental mistake. To think that there is a permanent core of a you who is watching me and the matrix. And that brings us to the second characteristic, not self. There is nothing that possesses durable existence, nothing that endures across two moments of time. So we have a doctrine of radical flux or radical momentariness. And that brings us to the third characteristic, dukkha. This is a Sanskrit word which is very difficult to translate into English because there is no one English word which can capture the conceptual and experiential range of dukkha. Some of you who study Greek and Christology will encounter a similar problem with the term logos, for example. Now here are three layers of dukkha. The first layer is so fundamental to our human existence, and again, you do not need Buddhist doctrine to remind you about it. Yesterday, I had a terrible headache, and that is dukkha. Whether or not you have heard of Buddhism, everyone has this kind of basic physical or psychosomatic dukkha. The second layer of dukkha is a bit more subtle. Suppose this evening at 9 p.m., you are having dinner with the family and you are feeling very happy. And yet, somewhere at the back of your mind, you know that even these happy moments will not last. Even they will pass away. Even our most deeply cherished ideas, values, and people are like a house built on sand. And this impermanence associated with change is the second, deeper form of dukkha. And then comes the third, the most subtle form of dukkha. Since I am not myself the Buddha or a Buddha, I can only try to point you to what this dukkha is like. Think of this third layer or dimension of dukkha as a kind of deep cosmic background radiation that shapes, suffuses, and structures every dimension of our existence simply by virtue of our existence. As you can see, this is a universal, global, what in some other context we could call a metaphysical claim. Whatever there is dukkha, is in this very fundamental third sense. Let's do a repeat of these three layers. Right now, do I have a toothache? Thankfully not. So I'm not in dukkha number one. Right now, do I have a terrible heartache, thinking that this Zoom meeting will pass away? Not quite. So I'm not in dukkha number two. But the Buddhist claim is that even now, even when I say that I do not consciously experience any dukkha, I'm yet in a universal matrix of dukkha. That dukkha which suffuses, structures, and shapes my existence. So to be or not to be, that is not the question, that is the dukkha. You can see why I have not been translating the word dukkha at all. There is simply no one English word which can capture all these three layers which I have outlined. Now let's add a little bit more content to the picture before we come to the distinctive Mahayana Buddhist understanding you see in the movie The Matrix. The reason why the structure and the process of existence itself is dukkha, the most fundamental meaning of dukkha, is because all existence is composed of processes shaped by what is called dependent origination. So I repeat, dependent origination, this is the concept that is absolutely fundamental to all strands and all styles of Buddhism, and in our case, Mahayana as well. So to understand what dependent origination is, just focus on the phrase itself, dependent origination and not independent origination. What would be an example of an entity which is independently originated? That is to say, self-originated and not originated through some external causal influence or power. In theistic contexts, one example or the prime example would be God. God is not dependently originated. In a Platonist context, one example, again, a primary example would be the soul. The soul is an immortal, simple, and indivisible principle. But the Buddhist teaching of dependent origination says that there is no such entity which is not originated through dynamic causal relations with something else. So what we have here is a worldview where the fundamental conceptual unit or building block is not substance, but process. It is not substance because, to remind ourselves, one key characteristic of all existence is not self. That is to say, not an enduring being and not a substance. Everything that there is a complex combination of interrelated processes or events and not substances or essences. Everything is immersed in and everything is contributing to a vastly intricate and gigantic causal web of interrelations, and call this web the matrix, if you will. And this is where the characteristic Mahayana Buddhist vocabulary of emptiness comes in. The word quote-unquote emptiness seeks to translate the Sanskrit word shunyata, and once again we have a problem with translation, just as we have a problem with translating dukkha. When we hear the word emptiness, we probably think of emptiness in a physical sense. So if I remove all the furniture from my living room, that room becomes empty. But let's think more poetically of emptiness. When you lose a loved one in your heart, you suddenly feel a deep emptiness. This form of emptiness is, of course, metaphorical. You cannot meaningfully ask questions like, what is the length of that emptiness inside your heart? However, the emptiness we are speaking about here now in Mahayana Buddhism is the most radical kind of emptiness you can visualize. It is not emptiness of this particular thing or that particular person. It is the emptiness of any one thing or any one person whatsoever, if these concepts are understood in terms of enduring substance. Nowhere will you find one thing or one person that is a substance, because everything is deeply interrelated with everything else in this dynamically unfolding causal web called the matrix. And precisely this lack of substantial solidity, things are substantially hollow, that is their emptiness, that is their shunyata. So let me try to describe for you a bit more concretely some dimensions of what this vision of the world looks like. So right now, you are looking at the Zoom screen, or so you think that is what is happening. But from this Mahayana Buddhist perspective, you are a complex bundle of psychosomatic processes. This Zoom screen is another complex bundle of photons. Your capacity of seeing is another complex bundle of psychosomatic processes which are becoming densely interrelated with the photons. And all of this is dependent origination. There is no substantial self or I separated from a substantial screen out there. Rather, you who are empty and the screen which is empty are two interrelated moments in a vast, a gigantic, intricate spatio-temporal matrix. Or to put it more precisely and concisely, you are not a substantial self. You are a flowing stream of interconnected processes. What I've said just now is, in fact, easier said than done. That is to say, it is much easier to think that we have grasped the vision than to actually live according to this vision. Suppose I ask you this question: precisely who has been listening to me over the last 20 minutes? I think most of us, and I include myself here, will be tempted to say something like this. Somewhere deep inside me, maybe inside my brain, there's a tiny little I, and this tiny little I has been observing the screen. But to repeat, according to the Buddhist teaching of dependent origination, you are not allowed to invoke such a tiny little I, precisely because everything is characterized by not self, everything is empty. All of this brings us to a very important point regarding Buddhist spiritual practice. If we are not allowed to use the vocabulary of I, how can we even speak about cultivating virtues of compassion, of altruism, and benevolence? Precisely who is meditating? Precisely who is seeking nirvana? And precisely, in this case, who is talking to you about Buddhism? And here, finally, we go back to this point about understanding Mahayana from two standpoints. Number one, the view from ground zero, and the view from spiritual perfection. In the view from ground zero, which by the way is where we are right now, we are in fact allowed to speak with the vocabulary of the tiny little I. So here, people have names like John Smith and Mary Edwards. People have driving licenses and passports, and people need passwords for their Zoom connections. There is no difference between Mahayana Buddhists and non-Buddhists at this level of ground zero. So if a non-Buddhist is hungry, they go to Sainsbury's and they buy a sandwich with a debit card. And if a Mahayana Buddhist is hungry, they do exactly the same. They go to Sainsbury's and they buy a sandwich with a debit card. So where is the difference there? The difference is that a Mahayana Buddhist would view this entire process, going to Sainsbury's and buying a sandwich with a debit card, as a quote unquote useful fiction. That is, we are talking about a fiction which is useful in the sense that it skillfully points us towards emptiness. Now, here are some examples of useful fictions from everyday contexts. The example that I always use in my lectures is that of our friend Santa Claus. So I invite you to think about your 4-year-old niece to whom you tell lies about Santa Claus. Why do you do that? Why do you lie to your niece about Santa Claus? Why don't you tell her straight away on day one that there is no Santa Claus, full stop? The answer, according to some child psychologists, is that if little children are given imaginary friends, such playful bonds help their psychodynamic development. That is, Santa Claus is a useful fiction. It is fictive because we know that there is no Santa Claus out there, but it is very useful for little children who can develop certain kinds of interpersonal skills through their relation with quote unquote Santa Claus. Or consider this very Zoom lecture. The language in which I'm speaking, English, is a useful fiction. The syntactical structures of English are not ingrained in the very fabric of reality. These are simply based on social consensus. Why are we not allowed to put the adjective after the noun in English? Well, social consensus. And yet think about how useful this fiction called English syntax and semantics is. We can use English to talk about Mahayana Buddhism and emptiness. So to go back to Mahayana, the language of the I is to be skillfully employed as a useful fiction. So let's say Mary is a practicing Mahayana Buddhist. When Mary goes to Sainsbury's, buy a sandwich with a debit card, which is of course imprinted with the language of the I and the you, she does not envision her own self, Sainsbury's, or the debit card as substantial entities in their own right. That is what we may do, but that's not what Mary does. Rather, Mary seeks to cultivate a deep understanding of how these three so-called entities are in fact interrelated processes and events which are causally interconnected in a vast, gigantic matrix of unfolding emptiness. In other words, here is the deeply counterintuitive and mind-bending and mind-dissolving paradox. You must skillfully employ the useful fiction of the I to realize that there is in fact no such I. So you can see why I said this is mind-bending, this is mind-dissolving. You're using the vocabulary of the I to deconstruct it, not from the outside, but from the inside. There never was such thing as an I. That was your misconception. But you kept on holding on to this I, thinking that it is durable, that it is permanent, and that is what is generating dukkha. Now, this Mahayana Buddhist pathway, the one that we have been discussing, is structured by the cultivation of profound insight into emptiness and superabundant compassion towards all sentient beings. And this conjunction, insight and compassion, is absolutely crucial. And this brings me to the very end of this presentation. I will only take about maybe 10 more minutes. So let's try to understand why this is so vital, this conjunction. It's not enough just to have insight. It is not enough just to have compassion. Why should you have both? So let's try to understand why this is so by looking into what would happen if one of these two, insight and compassion, were to be missing on the spiritual path. Now, suppose I claim to have lots and lots and lots of insight into emptiness. After all, I have been studying this thing for about 20 years, so I better have lots and lots and lots of insight. But I also claim that I have no interest, I have no inclination to develop compassion. What this would suggest is that I have not, in fact, cultivated true insight. And here is an example as to why. As I'm speaking to you, there is a man in New Zealand who is having a terrible toothache. When I think about this man, whom I do not know personally, what I do not feel is some kind of unbearable, heart-rending agony. I simply wish him well, and I hope he is able to get to the doctor soon. Now let's look at my frank confession. Namely, I do not feel this unbearable agony for this man from a Mahayana perspective. Why is this so? Why do I not feel this unbearable agony? Perhaps I think subliminally and unself-consciously that there is a real boundary to my own finite bounded self. And this boundary extends to the faculty of divinity and extends to my own relatives and my friends, but it does not extend to this man. And the moment I think in this way, I am setting up my own self again as an enduring entity which has these impermeable boundaries and is therefore supposedly disconnected from another entity out there. In other words, I have not cultivated this true insight into the radical emptiness of everyone and everything that is this matrix of becomingness. So what I need to do is to practice certain forms of what are called compassion meditations. So let's say for 15 minutes, I try to fill up 1/4 of the world with compassion. For the next 15 minutes, half of the world with compassion. For the next 15 minutes, 3/4 of the world with compassion. And by the time I arrive at 1 hour mark, I would have filled up the entire world with compassion. If I'm able to do this, it's a very big if I'm able to do this, that is to say, irradiate the entire universe with these luminous rays of superabundant compassion, streaming out to every remote corner of the multiple galaxies. This virtue of compassion will help me to generate a deeper insight into the matrix that is emptiness. So here's the problem. If I only have insight, but I don't have compassion. Now let's look at this conjunction from the other end. Suppose I happen to be someone who claims to have developed a huge amount of compassion, but I also claim that I don't need any insight. Insight is for PhD students, but I have no time to sit inside the library. What would be the problem now? The problem would be, or could be, that my so-called compassion is structured subliminally by egoism, by the belief that I'm an enduring self or substantial person. So when I go out to the world and help the poor on the road, maybe I do this because I think someone will give me the Nobel Prize for Peace, or because my peers will say that I'm awesome and super cool, and so on. Therefore, unless my compassion is structured and informed by a profound emptiness, by a profound insight into emptiness, my compassion can become a very subtle form of self-seeking. So to purify my altruism, I need to develop this insight into deep emptiness so that I can engage with people and help people without any sense of pity or self-righteous importance or condescension. Now suppose, all this is a big if and a big suppose, you do take up the spiritual path, where insight and compassion will become two deeply interrelated moments in a virtuous feedback loop. Then you would become someone who is training to become a Bodhisattva. Now to go back to our motive of the view from ground zero and the view from spiritual perfection, the Bodhisattva is an individual who is able to skillfully interweave these two standpoints depending on the spiritual maturity of the audience. So let's say tomorrow we invite a Bodhisattva to the Faculty of Divinity. From an external perspective, there may not be anything that distinguishes the Bodhisattva from you and me. Like you and me, the Bodhisattva will eat a sandwich, drink a glass of water, and check email. The difference again is this. While you and I may regard the sandwich, the glass, and the laptop, and the human persons around us as relatively stable and enduring entities, this is not how the Bodhisattva would envision the environment. For the Bodhisattva, all these entities are complexly interrelated processes in this unfolding matrix. But if indeed there is no I in the very fabric of reality, the question comes back to us again. Why does the Bodhisattva speak to us about Buddhist doctrine at all? And here's another. Precisely whom is the Bodhisattva helping if we are just a small current in a vast river stream? An answer to these kinds of questions is related to the practice of compassion. While the Bodhisattva does not view us as substantial selves, that is how we view ourselves, the Bodhisattva is also aware that we have fundamentally, mistakenly regarded ourselves as such, that is to say, as enduring substances. And to compassionately remove from us this fundamental misconception, the Bodhisattva will teach us about emptiness. And this teaching of emptiness will often take place through vocabularies that we understand on an everyday basis. And why is that so? This is because the Bodhisattva will skillfully make use of the means that are available to the Bodhisattva and to us. In other words, the Bodhisattva has reached or almost reached the view from spiritual perfection. And from this standpoint, the Bodhisattva compassionately continues to teach us about the world that is shaped by emptiness. So you can see that in the end, Mahayana Buddhism is much ado about nothing. And you may very well ask, if it is indeed nothing, why make such a big fuss about nothing? Why have Buddhists written volumes after volumes after volumes of texts in Sanskrit, Tibetan, Chinese, and Japanese? And the Mahayana answer, from what I have said so far, is simply this. Although it is indeed nothing, that is not a substantial being or self or person, we continue to mistakenly think that it is indeed something. And the Mahayana question, therefore, is not so much why is there something rather than nothing, but why is there nothing rather than something? And this is where our friend, the Bodhisattva, could be a figure like Neo or Morpheus in the Matrix, as our spiritual doctor, as our spiritual catalyst, compassionately gives us the healing and life-giving medicine of emptiness, and teaches us that in realizing the profound emptiness or radical relationality that we all are, we also become capable of being and becoming compassionate to one another. And this is where I shall end.